two sheaths on the bench. Both leather, both gone dark and soft around the belt loop, the way leather does when a man wears it every season for 20 years. One of them carried a fixed-blade hunting knife. The other one carries this. For most of American history, the hunting knife had exactly one feature nobody argued about. It did not fold. Then a small company in San Diego put a locking blade inside a leather sheath, and somehow convinced a generation of hunters they weren't giving anything up. That's a stranger thing than it sounds. Because nobody ever had to be sold on the fixed blade. It worked. It was simple. There was nothing in it to fail. A man with a good sheath knife had already solved his problem, and people do not generally trade away a solved problem. So the question underneath this whole story isn't how Buck built the 110. That part's been told plenty of times. The question is how a folding knife talked American hunters into leaving something they already trusted at home. And I think the answer has less to do with the blade than with about 4 inches of leather nobody ever looks at twice. First, let's kill an assumption, because the assumption is where most tellings of this story go wrong. Before 1964, American hunters were not all carrying fixed blades. Plenty were, but plenty carried big slip-joint folders, and a fair number were already carrying folders that locked. We know that from Buck itself. In Buck's own published company history, the account drawn from Tom Abels's book on the family business, the board authorized development of a new folding lock blade knife on April 18, 1963. And that history is blunt about the market they were stepping into. There were already large folding knives out there with locking systems. None of them had been very successful. So Al Buck did the least glamorous and most useful thing a manufacturer can do. He bought 3 of the rival knives. The team handled them, used them, took them apart. And his conclusion, in his own words, was that all 3 had features they liked and some they didn't, and that they didn't like the looks of any of them. Sit with that a second. The complaint was never that a locking folder was impossible. Somebody had already built one. The complaint was that nobody had built one a hunter wanted to look at. That's not an engineering problem. That's a persuasion problem. The man they handed it to was an engineer named Guy Hooser, described in Buck's own history as an off-the-wall sort, who could do more with baling wire and second-hand scrap iron than most men could do with a fully equipped shop. By midsummer, he was back with a model. On August 8, 1963, the directors approved the basic design, told him to reconfigure the handle, and suggested he work in a brass liner. And here's the part that ought to be better known. Inside Buck, the folding knife was not the priority. The program getting top billing that year was a new fixed-blade fishing knife. That one they were sure would sell. The folder, they figured, would be a nice addition to the catalog, and there were, in the words of one of the men in that room, serious questions about how successful it would be. It didn't reach full production until September of 1964. Within 6 months, it was the hottest new knife in the industry. Within 2 years, Buck was calling it the #1 selling sports knife in the world. Nobody in that room saw it coming. So what changed between the rivals that failed and the one that didn't? Everybody points at the lock. I want to point somewhere else first. Look at how the thing was handed to you. Not in a pocket, in a leather belt sheath. Think about what that actually asked of a hunter in 1964. He had been wearing a knife on his belt his entire adult life. Same side, same spot, same reach, without looking. That isn't preference. That's muscle memory, built up over decades of dark mornings. The 110 didn't ask him to give any of it up. It didn't ask him to learn a pocket clip. It didn't ask him to open a blade one-handed. It didn't ask him to start thinking of himself as a pocket knife man. It asked him to unthread one sheath and thread on another. That's the whole trick. And it's so simple it's easy to walk right past. The 110 didn't get rid of the hunting knife sheath. It shrank what was inside it. The object changed enormously. The habit barely changed at all. And that's a pattern you'll find anywhere people take up new tools. Folks will accept a radical change in an object far more readily than a small change in a ritual. Change the thing and keep the motion, and adoption comes easy. Change the motion, and you'll be arguing about it for 20 years. I can't tell you Buck set out to exploit that. I've found no evidence they thought about it in those terms. But that leather sheath is where the argument was won. And listen, if the tools your father carried still make more sense to you than whatever's trending this season, you're in about the right place here. Stick around. Everything else about the design keeps telling that same story. Nothing here is new. Trust it. Start with what modern reviewers treat as the knife's greatest sin: weight. A standard 110 runs right around 7 1/5 ounces. In today's vocabulary, that's a flaw. It's the number a reviewer holds up as the reason to buy something else. But weight only reads as a flaw in a culture that has already decided lightness is the goal. A man judging a tool by hand in 1964 was working from a different vocabulary. Heft meant material. Material meant it wouldn't fail on him. Brass bolsters, brass liners, brass pins. The knife announced its seriousness through your wrist before you ever opened the blade. I want to be careful here, because this is easy to romanticize. 7 ounces is not objectively better than 4. Weight is not strength. A heavy knife can be badly made, and a light one can be superb. That isn't the claim. The claim is narrower, and I think it holds. In a market full of men who had spent their lives sizing up axes and hammers and sheath knives by feel, weight was a signal they already knew how to read. And the 110 spoke that language fluently. Now, the lock. Here we have to correct something you will hear repeated constantly. Buck did not invent the lockback. Not close. Backlock folders run back through the Spanish Navaja and centuries of European work, and American makers were producing locking folders long before 1964. What the 110 did was different, and honestly, more impressive. As it's been put by cutlery historians, lockbacks had been present in the United States for well over 200 years. They had simply never been made affordable and convenient in mass production. Buck didn't invent the mechanism. Buck normalized it, and what the lock changed wasn't leverage, it was permission. A slip joint can close on you. Every man who used one knew it and worked around it. Once a blade locks open, a folder stops behaving like a pocket knife and starts behaving, in the hand, in the moment, like a small fixed blade. That's the psychological threshold. That's what let a hunter use a folder for work he'd always reserved for a sheath knife. The silhouette finished the job. Clip point, brass, dark wood, black leather. Nothing about it looked like the future. It looked like a hunting knife that had been folded in half. Which may be the most disruptive thing about it, how little it looked like a disruption. And the price sat in the same carefully chosen place. $16 at launch, according to Buck's own history. And inside the company, that price was a genuine worry at the time. It was not throwaway money in 1964, but it wasn't custom knife money either. It landed exactly where a man could tell himself he was buying a tool for the next 20 years, rather than indulging himself. Then came the part everybody covers. I'd like to cover it differently. The copies arrived fast. Buck's own history says several competitors quickly introduced knockoff versions, and it includes one detail I find genuinely remarkable. One of them ran an advertisement using a photograph of the Buck knife. Not a photo of their own knife, a photo of Buck's. Over the following years, the pattern spread everywhere. Schrade's Uncle Henry LB7 is probably the best remembered of them, and it sold in serious numbers to men who wanted the shape at a friendlier price. So the form was copyable, obviously, which raises the question nobody bothers to ask. When everybody can copy your shape, what is actually left that belongs to you? The usual answer is a mythology about secret heat treatment. I'd push back on that, because the real story is better than the myth. Buck's heat treating is genuinely central to the company, and the man behind it is documented, not legendary. Paul Boss was inducted into the Blade Magazine Cutlery Hall of Fame in recognition of decades as a leading authority on heat-treating knife steel. Buck's own account describes how, in the late 70s, he helped them build their in-house department, and how he eventually ran his own heat-treating business right inside the Buck plant. But here's the thing people miss. He was not sitting on a hidden formula. At the same time he was working for Buck, he was treating blades for custom knife makers all over America. His methods weren't a secret. They were shared. Which means what Buck actually held wasn't a recipe nobody else could obtain. It was something considerably harder to copy than a recipe. The same result, on hundreds of thousands of knives a year, decade after decade. Anybody can hit a specification once. Hitting it 1,000,000 times is a different discipline entirely. Now here's where the story turns on itself. Take the argument that sold the 110 in 1964 and strip Buck's name off it. It reads like this: why carry more knife than you need when this one does nearly the same work and is easier to live with? That's a convenience argument. It's the only argument the 110 ever needed, and it worked completely. Then, decades later, somebody aimed it at Buck. Why carry 7 ounces of brass and wood in a belt sheath, a knife that takes 2 hands to open and 2 hands to close, when a lighter folder rides in your pocket, opens with a thumb, and handles everything a modern week actually asks of a blade? Same argument, different target. The 110 didn't just win a fight. It taught the market how the fight was scored, and once good enough, and easier to carry, became the winning move. Somebody was always going to run that play again. For years, the weight was part of what made this knife feel serious. And then one day, the weight became the reason it stayed in the drawer. And you don't have to take that from me, because Buck said it themselves. In a company post published in May of 2026, Buck wrote that, over the years, one customer request rose above all the others. People wanted a pocket clip. Read that again. The single most requested change to the knife that replaced the belt sheath hunting knife was, get it off the belt. Buck's answer was the 110 and 112 Slim Heritage Elite. Thinner through the frame, a deep carry pocket clip, modern steel. The company frames it as refinement rather than replacement, and the classic 110 stays in the line. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. In 1964, the sheath was the bridge that carried men across. 60-some years later, the sheath is the thing being engineered around. It's tempting to explain that with a story about hunters vanishing. The federal numbers don't really support it, and what they do show is more interesting. Paid hunting license holders in the United States peaked at roughly 16.7 million in 1982. In 2021, the figure was about 15.9 million. That's not a collapse, that's a drift. But look at the same data as a share of the country. In 1980, licensed hunters were somewhere around 6.9% of the American population. By 2021, closer to 4.8%. The hunters didn't disappear. The country grew up around them, and that's the real change. The 110 never lost its users. It lost its position as a default. The object a man in almost any American town might plausibly have on his belt. Hunting went from something a large slice of the country did to something a smaller slice of the country does. And a knife that had been ordinary became specific. Which brings us to the second mystery. The lazy answer is nostalgia. I don't buy it. Nostalgia keeps objects on shelves. It does not keep them in production for 60 years. A tool survives when it still has a job. The 110's job got smaller and sharper. For a great many owners, it isn't the everyday knife anymore. It's the deer season knife, the camp knife, the truck knife, the one that comes out for work, that feels like it deserves it. A product doesn't have to be the best at everything to survive. It needs one role that still matters. And then there's the other thing keeping it alive, which almost nobody describes accurately. Buck's Forever Warranty covers each knife against defects in material and workmanship for the life of the knife. I want to be precise here because people overstate this constantly. It is not a no questions asked replacement policy. It does not cover normal wear. It does not cover misuse, rust, or modification. Take your knife apart yourself and you've voided it. But there is a line on Buck's own warranty page that stopped me cold. It asks that if your knife has sentimental value, you say so when you send it in, so they can determine whether to repair it rather than replace it. Think about what that sentence implies. A factory built a step into its own repair process for the possibility that the object in the box isn't really a knife anymore. It's somebody's father. And there's one more asymmetry worth noticing on that same page. Buck warrants the knife for the life of the knife. The sheath is covered for 1 year. The leather is the part that's expected to lose, which tells you something, if you sit with it. A sheath only wears out because the knife kept getting carried. Even the wood has a story now. When federal rules on endangered timber tightened in the 90s, Buck moved off genuine ebony to a resin-treated laminate. Then in January of 2019, they announced a partnership with Taylor Guitars, which runs a sawmill in Cameroon, and ebony came back to the 110. And here's the detail I can't get out of my head. Taylor's own account of that operation describes supplying Buck with knife handle blanks made from ebony offcuts, pieces too small to become guitar parts. The handle on a brand new 110 may well be made from what was left over after somebody's fretboard. Here's what I keep coming back to. The 110 didn't beat the fixed hunting knife by being something completely new. It won by feeling familiar enough that a careful man was willing to change. It kept the belt, kept the leather, kept the weight, kept the clip point, and hid the entire revolution inside a shape people already trusted. And then, it lost its territory the same way it took it. Somebody came along with an easier answer, and the argument the 110 had invented got turned around and pointed straight back at it. But it never disappeared. It just stopped being the knife for almost everything, and became the knife that means something specific, which, at the end of a working life, might be the better outcome. The one on Grandpa's belt is the one in his son's drawer. And a good many of those still come out in November. If there's an old 110 in your father's drawer, and you're trying to work out when it was made, I've put together a free dating and family history guide. Tang stamps, dot codes, era clues, and a record sheet to write down what you know before it's lost. Links in the description, no cost, and I'd like to hear it from you. When did the first Buck 110 come into your family, and who bought it? If you know the year, give me the year, and if you've still got the original sheath, that's the one I really want to hear about.